Ja, was macht Corona mit uns? Was macht Corona mit der Welt? Und damit verbunden, was macht die Welt mit Corona? Wie soll die Welt, wie sollen wir alle reagieren auf was im Moment in der Welt und in der Schweiz passiert? Das sind Fragen, die wir uns tatsächlich alle stellen. Natürlich vor allem auch die Wirtschaft. Wir haben es gehört von Präsident Heinz Karrer vorher. Die Wirtschaft, sie leidet massiv derzeit in der Schweiz, aber auch weltweit. Stand Sommer 2020 haben bereits über 150 Millionen Menschen auf der Welt ihren Job verloren wegen der Pandemie. Und die Bekämpfung der Krise des Virus kostet bislang über 4 Billionen Dollar. Wie soll das weitergehen? Das werden wir jetzt im Kamingespräch ein bisschen erörtern. Und zwar mit einer Ökonomin, die sich tagtäglich mit diesen Fragen auseinandersetzt. Wir haben niemand Geringeren als die Chef-Ökonomin des Internationalen Währungsfonds, des IMF, zu Gast. Und ich erläutere mit ihr genau diese Fragen, die uns derzeit alle umtreiben. Was macht das Coronavirus mit uns derzeit? Was bedeutet es für die Wirtschaft? Und wahrscheinlich noch viel wichtiger, was bedeutet es für die Zukunft? Die Zukunft der Weltwirtschaft, die Zukunft der Welt, aber auch die Zukunft der Schweiz. Bevor es losgeht, auch hier noch ganz kurz ein Video mit der Vorstellung.
Dr. Gita Gopinath ist die Wirtschaftsberaterin und Direktorin der Forschungsabteilung des Internationalen Währungsfonds, IWF. Sie ist beurlaubte Professorin der Harvard-Universität. Gita Gopinath ist Mitherausgeberin des aktuellen Handbook of International Economics und war zuvor Mitherausgeberin der American Economic Review und geschäftsführende Herausgeberin der Review of Economic Studies. Von 2016 bis 2018 war sie Wirtschaftsberaterin des Chief Ministers des indischen Bundesstaates Kerala. Sie war ebenfalls Mitglied der Eminent Persons Advisory Group on G20 Matters für das indische Finanzministerium. Frau Gopinath ist gewählte Fellow der American Academy of Arts and Science und der Econometric Society und erhielt den Distinguished Alumnus Award der University of Washington. Im Jahr 2019 wurde sie von der Zeitschrift Foreign Policy zu einer der Top Global Thinkers ernannt. Im Jahr 2014 wurde sie vom IWF zu einer der Top 25 Ökonomen unter 45 Jahren ernannt. Und 2011 wurde sie vom Weltwirtschaftsforum zur Young Global Leader gewählt.
Gita, if you allow me a personal question at the beginning, we've all been affected by this crisis worldwide. How did you experience the coronavirus, the pandemic, and of course the lockdown as well?
Actually, on a personal level, there was a silver lining to this crisis. I was commuting between Boston and Washington, D.C. To do my job as IMF chief economist because my family was all in Boston. And now because we're all working from home, I'm not commuting, and so I'm able to be with my family. So there's been that one silver lining to it. But that aside, these are, of course, challenging times for all of us who are used to interacting with people and to deal with a crisis when you can't be physically in the presence of your colleagues or in the presence of authorities is really quite challenging and at the same time kind of interesting.
It's very nice to hear someone say a silver lining or speak about a silver lining because the actual outlooks that we get here aren't that positive. What do you make? What does the IMF make of that crisis and the economic outlook of it?
And this crisis, like we've said, is the worst since the Great Depression, which was back in 1921. So, this is the most severe recession we are all living through. It's a crisis like no other. So we don't have experience in that sense of dealing with it. It's a pandemic-driven recession, a massive lockdown across the world, contractions in the second quarter of 2020 that really have no parallel in history. It's the suddenness and the severity with which economies were contracting is just, unheard of. And now we're in the stage where we are seeing recovery. So as of now, we can say that the worst is behind us. But that said, the recovery is slow, it's gradual in many parts of the world, and there's still many risks because we still don't have a solution for this health crisis.
Before we talk about possible solutions and how they might affect the economic outlook as well, when you say it's a crisis like no other, of course that has a lot to do with the uncertainty as well. As you say, we don't know how this thing will turn out. How worried are you as an economist, but also as someone who's very close to all regions in the world, to different countries who come up to you and ask you for advice as well?
I mean, this crisis gives all of us sleepless nights. We have 189 member countries, and we see the many parts of the world struggling at a humanitarian level. I mean, we're talking about more than 800,000 human deaths because of COVID and counting. And this crisis is simply not, it's not over. The health crisis, we still need to find a solution in terms of effective treatments and vaccines. Now, there's a lot in the pipeline, and there is the potential that we will have a quicker recovery than maybe some of us worried about. But that said, there is tremendous uncertainty. And then, of course, different countries are getting impacted in different ways. There are some that rely very heavily on tourism that are getting impacted much harder than others. Countries that are oil exporters are also getting very deeply affected, though we've seen some recovery in oil prices. And if you look at low-income countries, this crisis can set back development by a decade. So this is not just a crisis we have to deal with now or this year. It's going to be something we deal with next year and going into the next several years, because we are anticipating a gradual recovery.
When you speak about the differences between these countries, of course, we know that it's unfortunately always the most fragile countries that suffer the most. Do you see that parallel as well with this crisis, meaning that will the wealthier, the richer countries get out of it quicker than, let's say, the poorer, the more fragile ones?
Oh, absolutely. The recovery is uneven geographically. So if you look at the more advanced economies, the ones that have more fiscal space, they've been able to provide much stronger lifelines to their people, to their firms, and you can see a faster recovery. On the other hand, you have countries which have health systems that are less prepared for this kind of a pandemic. You have countries that aren't able to provide the kind of financial support that rich countries are able to do. We have very large informal sectors in these economies. So we're talking about a very big loss in livelihood. I mean, the World Bank put that number at 70 million additional people entering extreme poverty. So we're talking about a big divergence here in terms of prospects and recoveries.
Mm-hmm. Of course, we have those differences, but we also know that by now everybody's interconnected and we live in one world. And you said in your latest update as well, or outlook, that we're all in the same boat. Does that mean also that there is a risk of spillback, that from one country to the other, we're all actually facing the same challenges and the same risks?
Well, we see that, for instance, what's happening in international trade. We have a whole collapse in international trade. So the way to think about it is that, if advanced economies recover, but you have a big chunk of the emerging and developing world that is still experiencing very weak growth in recessionary territory, then we're going to see weak global demand, and that's going to spill back. So this is also an important issue to think about when we're at this point, at this stage, when countries are talking about vaccines and making available vaccines for their own people. There has to be a coordinated effort to make sure that the vaccines or any other kind of effective treatment is available at an affordable rate globally, because we're all in this together. There is, if you're going to have the virus in full strength in some part of the world, there's the risk of it spilling back. If there is going to be a big collapse in demand in the rest of the world, that affects all countries. And so countries have to work together to improve everybody's lot, not just their own.
In that regard, I always feel a bit frightened to ask that question about, the crisis being an opportunity as well. But do you see this crisis as maybe being an opportunity of countries working together more closely than they did before?
I think countries are definitely now being forced to work more closely together. It's not something that you can choose to. We entered this crisis with what I would say, declining global cooperation. Now, we had trade tensions across countries. And so, global cooperation is not exactly at its heyday at this point. But this crisis is calling for all hands on deck. I mean, the International Monetary Fund has provided financial assistance, COVID-related financial assistance to over 75 countries at this point. So all of our membership is supporting this financing help that the IMF is giving. We've had the G20 debt service suspension initiative, which is very important, and even more will be needed on that front. Central banks around the world, and the major central banks around the world have provided swap lines that have helped to stabilize global financial markets. And low-income countries will need concessional financing and outright aid and grants in many cases because they cannot carry the burden of even ever-rising debt levels.
Speaking of help and speaking of stabilizing, we speak to you from Switzerland, of course, and as you may know, the Swiss government has been very active in helping the local community, the local economy as well. There have been grants, there have been short-term unemployment money, there have been help from the government, from the state. Is that a trend that you see in other countries as well, or are we a bit special in that regard?
So the Swiss government has provided impressive support to its people and to its businesses. And that's something that we see happening in other advanced economies. So it's not globally true because not all countries have the fiscal space. Switzerland has the fiscal space coming into this crisis. But you see that in many advanced economies, very large, unprecedented levels of support in terms of unemployment support, short-term work support, work subsidies, loan forbearance, providing liquidity to corporates. So there are many, many steps that have been taken. And yes, Switzerland has done an impressive job, and as many other advanced economies have.
I was just wondering, as useful as this may be, how does that make you feel as an economist? Because, of course, there are voices in Switzerland as well that say, there has to be a stop to this because we can't just go back to the governments and the state being the sole provider of the economy. Do you see a risk as well that we might get into new dependency in a way?
So this crisis called for the kind of support that was given. This is a recession that was triggered by a pandemic that required that measures be taken to prevent the spread of this virus, and lockdowns was a part of those measures. And when you do that, you're obviously putting people out of work, and you're putting businesses out of work, so you're shutting them down. So support was required. Now, it's true that as this crisis goes on, and there's this big question that the uncertainty remains about how many more months of this are we going to see, right? I think it's quite clear that at this point, there will be some sectors, and that would be the travel industry, for instance, that will see, a decline in demand for a prolonged period. Even when this crisis is over, I can see firms and deciding not to travel as much. People actually do a lot more of what we're doing right now, which is interacting over on the internet or online. And so we would see a shrinking in that. So it's very important that the support takes that into account, because you cannot support industries that are going to shrink. It's no point throwing money at that. You have to support instead sectors that are going to be growing, for instance, like e-commerce, digital economy. And also you need to support workers so that they can get retrained, reskilled to work in these newer kinds of growing sectors. But support will be needed. It will have to be withdrawn gradually as the recovery becomes stronger. I mean, Switzerland is now almost fully reopened in many ways, far ahead of many other countries. It's kind of far more in progress in that front. So you can see how over time there's going to be a winding down of that kind of support. But we don't want to repeat the mistake of the global financial crisis when countries were too hasty in pulling back support. And then that actually worsened the situation going forward.
So pulling back is the bigger risk, or hastily pulling back than staying too long, in your view?
My view is that if you're a country with fiscal space, given the uncertainty that exists, one would be cautious. It would be better to be cautious about pulling back support at this point.
I read somewhere, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think about 100 countries have come and called you for help, or at least for some advice. How important or how difficult is it to kind of, take every one of these countries in their own regard, or taking into consideration that they all work a little bit differently, I guess. So I guess there can't be just one solution for all of them, right?
Yeah, so at this point, what we have been providing, the 100 countries that came to us, and we've at this point provided financing to 75 of them, most of this is what we call is emergency financing. So it's financing to help countries deal with the health crisis that they have, to make sure that they have the right equipment that they need, that they have the right amount of medical facilities to deal with the health crisis, and then also then to provide some amount of support to their people. So this is unlike in the past when typically IMF money comes with programs that have conditionalities. This time we are responding much more rapidly and giving money to countries with almost no conditions, but subject to the requirement that they use the money for the purposes that it was given for, which is to help their people in terms of the health sphere and in terms of basic livelihoods.
What's your view on eventually maybe paying back that money? Because there is also a big discussion that this could be money lost forever, and some of the companies, some of the countries won't be able to pay back anyway. So do you think we should consider all this money, all these grants, all this help that we're giving at the moment as being lost?
So, when the IMF gives money to countries, we always first ascertain their debt levels and how sustainable their debt levels are. So we make the assessment that this is a country that has a sustainable debt level, which is why we expect that it will be eventually able to repay its creditors, including the IMF. But it's absolutely the case that there are going to be some countries for whom you will need debt restructuring, that it's not going to be enough just to have debt service moratoria. There'll have to be debt forgiveness. Especially for some low-income countries. There are some countries that entered this crisis with already very high levels of debt. Again, and I would focus on low-income countries here. So it's not going to be just enough to put a moratorium on it. There will be some countries that require restructuring, that will require, and help in the form of outright aid and grants, because they will not be able to otherwise return back in a healthy shape after this crisis.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking when you said that some countries entered this crisis already with high debt levels. Of course, there's never a good time for a crisis, but in that regard, that crisis hit probably at the worst moment, right?
Oh, indeed, yes. When you have very, very high debt levels, you don't have any space to borrow anymore. The markets aren't going to give you any money. And in this particular case, at least, in dealing with this crisis, that these countries do need some money because this is required to, keep people alive. And they need the support for this. But if you came in with very high levels of debt, then very quickly, one starts talking about debt restructurings that have to be done.
We've been talking about the interventions by the state, by the governments. There's also been interventions by the central banks. And, speaking to you from Switzerland again, that's been the case here as well. The Swiss National Bank has been heavily intervening in that crisis, of course, to keep the franc where it is and not, being too much of a safe haven as well. What do you make internationally of the interventions and the actions of the central banks?
So Switzerland has to deal with safe haven flows, being a safe haven currency. And in a crisis like this, especially in the early stages, when there was a lot of financial market turbulence and there was very high levels of angst in financial markets, there was a rush to reserve currencies, including the Swiss franc, a safe haven currency. And our view is that for a country that is experiencing very rapid appreciations, if that is going to weigh on their ability to attain their inflation target, and if it's going to generate risks of disinflation or deflation, then in those circumstances, there is an argument for some intervention. If I step back and think more globally, actually this time around globally, if you look at emerging markets, you have seen less foreign exchange intervention than, for instance, during the global financial crisis. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that this crisis is a global crisis, which means that it's not just that the emerging markets were in trouble, but advanced economies were in trouble, and you had the US central bank cutting interest rates dramatically. So that allowed emerging markets to also cut interest rates and not have to worry as much about currency turmoil. And secondly, emerging markets have now built much more credible monetary policy frameworks. They're actually doing quantitative easing. For the first time, several of them are doing it, which is something we never experienced before. But again, in the matter of FX intervention, globally, we've actually seen for many countries a lesser FX intervention than in the past.
Mm-hmm. So there are differences, of course, but if we come back to Switzerland and the Swiss National Bank, you think that pressure will increase, will get higher in the months to come?
Well, I think the economies are recovering, and as economies recover, firstly, with the stability that has come about in financial markets, not just stability, now you've seen many of them actually booming, we're actually seeing less of these kinds of safe haven flows and pressures on safe haven currencies. And you see the dollar from the start of this year has, if anything, depreciated relative to its partner countries. And so I think the pressure has come down and will continue to come down. Now, the risk, of course, is that if we have worse news on the medical front, that optimism on vaccines disappears and on treatments disappears, and we have the fall season when you have very strong second waves of the virus, and then financial market turmoil, then that would be another scenario where you would see again a big demand for safe haven currencies, and then again you can see why some central banks might want to intervene at that point.
We're already speaking about the future in a way. So let me tackle that big uncertainty for the future as well. You talked about it yourself. Still the uncertainty. When will the vaccine be available? Will there be a second wave? Are we already in it? Will there be even a third or a fourth wave? What do you make of all that uncertainty as an economist, but also as the IMF, which has to be some kind of reliable source on what could happen?
Well, this certainly makes forecasting even more difficult than it already is. And it also means that whenever you see for businesses who have to make investment decisions, they're holding back because of the uncertainty, because you have to see what the next several months would look like and whether there will be a durable solution to this crisis. There is a risk of consumers holding back consumption because of wanting to hold precautionary savings. We're seeing weaknesses in aggregate demand that's reflected in weaknesses in inflation around the world. So these are the kinds of effects that uncertainty has. And we have to see this, unfortunately, this is one of those things we just get more information on a daily basis, on a monthly basis. The hope is that there will actually be a vaccine. At this point, given the number of trials that exist, given the number of vaccine trials that are already in phase 3, based on past history, there's now a 90% chance that there will actually be a vaccine that will work. But again, there's a 10% chance that there won't. And so there is this uncertainty out there, and it's weighing on individuals, it's weighing on governments, because governments have to decide whether they want to, is now the time to pull back support, or how much longer do you want to commit to keeping support? I think the approach in a situation like this is to actually do this on a kind of a piecemeal basis, which is to commit to like a few months ahead, because you just don't know exactly where you will be in a few months from now.
Mm-hmm. So I take from this that finding the vaccine is probably one of the maybe the magic potion in solving this crisis, even if we don't know when this is going to happen. Of course, there are other factors like testing, the masks as well. Of course, do you have any advice for countries and for governments how to go on with this question? Because there are so many different approaches to it as well. How much should we test? How much should we let people wear masks? How much should we open events or open the life in a way? Do you have any kind of guidelines in that regard?
So I think what we are seeing now is that countries are living with the virus, and they are recovering from very deep downturns. I would say a few lessons that we've learned is that simple measures like widespread testing, tracing, wearing masks, hygiene, washing your hands, maintaining safe distance does help. I mean, these are very low-cost measures that help contain the negative impact of the virus. A second thing that we've also learned is that at this point, because people's behaviors have also changed in the way they interact with each other and they try to keep some social distance, that it's no longer needed to have like a national level lockdown, but having a much more targeted lockdown, and so that you're going to have a less negative impact on the economy as a whole is hugely important. We also know that there are some vulnerable categories of people as opposed to the others. Older people are more vulnerable. You want to be able to protect them, and they should be the ones who are staying home, for instance. More generally, depending upon the stage of the number of cases you're seeing in your economies, you can decide to open more or less quickly. But having good data, good statistics, keeping a close eye on where these viruses are developing just helps. And it really does work.
Of course, all this depends on us, on the people. Almost a philosophical question, maybe. But do you feel confident that the people, that we all are reasonable enough to learn enough from this crisis to not make it even worse?
We have seen behavioral changes. So, of course, there will be, we're all heterogeneous. We're all different kinds of people with strong independent minds. But if you just look at the facts in terms of the number of people wearing masks, the number of people who are maintaining safe distance, you just see that there has been now, I think, what's a permanent change. So, for instance, you will hear even arguments that the fall, common flu may not be as severe because people are now used to wearing masks and not shaking hands too often and not and with good hygiene practice. So I think it is a lesson that people have learned. Part of the reason why Japan had so few cases was because they were used to already wearing masks. It was part of the culture of wearing masks in certain seasons. And I can see this being a long-lasting effect on many people.
So quite an optimistic chief economist who also sees the silver lining. There's a very interesting project from the IMF going forward and moving forward. It's called Build Back Better. Can you explain the idea behind it?
Absolutely. I mean, the way we see it is this is also an opportunity for us to think about the kind of future we want to have. And that is one which is going to address climate issues, something that's been on, I would say, the front burner for a long time, but still hasn't taken off. The second is on issues of inequality, another big issue that's been around for a while. And the third is we can see a big push for digital transformation and to make sure that all countries in the world are able to benefit from it. So as this crisis matures and we start seeing governments putting in place further support to get a stronger recovery, there will be a round of public investment. It would make perfect sense for that public investment to be greener, to be climate friendly, and to encourage a transition to a low carbon economy so that we can meet the goals of keeping emissions at low levels and prevent the planet from overheating. So that's one step. We also know that those kinds of measures create jobs, and we need a job-rich recovery, so that helps. Secondly, in terms of reducing inequality, I mean, that is something the global economy has seen for a while, and it has to be addressed. Making sure that there is healthcare for everybody, universal medical care, appropriate social safety nets is something that governments will have to now provide on a permanent basis. And again, investing in a digital infrastructure, making sure that there is sufficient skilling and training in these kinds of skills, that's another area for transformation. So these are kinds of areas where we think about building back better.
Of course, that goes along the idea of the crisis being an opportunity as well, and that we learn from it in a good way. Of course, you might argue as well that maybe the opposite will be the case, that everybody just fights for himself or herself, and the countries just kind of make whatever they can to get out of this crisis. Aren't you afraid that this will kind of push some countries in that direction as well?
I mean, there is a real risk of that. That is for sure. I mean, we entered this crisis already with global trade under threat. global cooperation not exactly being strong. And right now, we will see nationalism of various kinds. For instance, the most imminent ones is what we call, one calls vaccine nationalism, where every country is, going after vaccine supplies, which are in limited supply because they're not going to be able to ramp up production so quickly. But to go after those vaccines just for their own people. Now, of course, there is an argument for taking care of your own people. But again, countries will have to work together. You don't want a world where countries are growing at very different rates. You have large divergences in income, very large increases in poverty around the world, social unrest, geopolitical tensions. None of that is good for any individual country. So while there are real risks of people becoming more inward-looking, I would hope the better sense prevails. And there is a push on many levels, maybe less vocal out there, but that happens behind closed doors of people trying to work closely together. The EU Recovery Fund, I think, is a very impressive achievement too in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of some nationalist tendencies, you speak to us from the United States, and I'm aware I'm walking on thin ice here because you can't speak too much about political issues. However, there is a big election coming up this year. Is there any outcome that would be better for the world economy?
You're right. I cannot answer this question. I think as in general, times of elections are times of uncertainty, and certainty has impact either ways, regardless of who wins. But having clear certainty at the end of the process is what I would hope for.
Very diplomatic. I won't stress more on that question. Let us come back to the coronavirus and also the reaction and the let's say the actions that the countries took. There is a big difference between some countries. Here in Europe, of course, we have the Swedish model, which was kind of open all the time. They didn't go into a full lockdown. They kept working. Of course, they had more casualties. Other countries were more strict. They had a stricter lockdown. They had stricter rules as well. Is there a kind of a common theme or a common kind of understanding from your part which system worked better on an economic side?
So this is something that we are still trying to figure out the answers to, and there's reason for that because there's a trade-off between now and what happens in the future. But let me tell you what the facts are. The facts are that indeed, if you look at, for instance, GDP growth in the first half of this year, the countries that had more severe lockdowns were the ones that had bigger drops in GDP growth. But we also know that it's not just about whether you have lockdowns or not. Even in parts of the world where there were no lockdowns, the scare of the virus led people to voluntarily put themselves in lockdown and to voluntarily social distance. And that's an effect that is also very strong. So in many countries, we've seen reopenings where people are allowed to go and engage in activities, but you've seen a very slow recovery because if you still see cases rising, people hold back. So what I'm trying to say is that the fact is indeed in the direction of saying that steeper lockdowns have a bigger effect on economic activity, but we also know that these lockdowns help reduce the number of virus cases and the virus deaths. So it actually helps curtail the health crisis, which then encourages people to come back and engage in economic activity. And then there is going to be the question of what happens several months into the future about which are the countries that benefited, ones that had severe lockdowns or did not. And we still don't know the answer to that. But but honestly, people will voluntarily self-distance themselves, even if there is no de jure lockdown out there. And so one has to deal with the health crisis first and foremost to get activity back up to anywhere close to normal.
Mm-hmm. we're almost at the end, but if we talk about regions or countries that are most affected, we always talk about the countries we know most and the countries that are probably closer to us. However, there are, at least for me, some huge white spots on the map. If we talk about Africa, for example, or countries in Asia that we never hear about in the news. Are there regions or countries that you're particularly worried about for the future regarding the crisis and the aftermath?
I mean, at this point, pretty much all regions of the world give us reason for worry. Now, the advanced parts of the world, we are seeing a faster recovery. China is actually one country where the recovery has been the most V-shaped among all countries, even comparing to advanced economies of the world. But then we have nations in Africa, we have countries in Latin America, we have countries in East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, that are all being hit very hard. And if you're an island nation that relies heavily on tourism, then you're basically looking at a future where the biggest source of your GDP has disappeared. And if you're a country that relies heavily on oil exports, again, it's a big hit to you. And so while we expect a lot of countries that have the fiscal space that they need and the monetary policy space they need to recover gradually, but over time, and return back to some kind of pre-crisis levels in the next year or so, there are many other countries for whom the recovery would be much more what we call L-shaped. And these tend to be low-income countries, developing countries, where the lost output is not something that you ever regain back.
Last question, and I try to end it with on a high note. What makes you hopeful about the future, and what makes you hopeful about how we tackle this crisis all together, or in the same boat, as you said?
I mean, what makes me hopeful is that just as unprecedented this crisis has been, it's also been unprecedented, the positive response on one hand, in many countries. The response or the innovation that's happened, the medical innovation that's happened, the speed with which treatments and vaccines are being put through trials is something that we've never seen before. People are adapting. We're all living with the virus. The virus is still out there, but we're still living with it, and economies are recovering. And we're seeing innovation in work from home, in e-medicine, in the promises of the digital economy. So I think that while on one hand there is the scare that we've gotten from the crisis, my hope is that this crisis also shows us that as a people we are able to rise to the occasion and deal with this crisis, and that will give us the strength to make even bigger changes in the future, and those were on sustainable growth, climate, taking care of the climate, and on reducing inequality.
Thank you very much for your thoughts and your insights, Gita.
Thank you.